On a humid morning in August 1971, a 63-year-old man sat at his desk in Richmond, Virginia. He looked like your typical grandfather. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and smoked a cigarette. To the outside world, Lewis Powell was just a mild-mannered lawyer. He was a board member for a cigarette company and a pillar of his local community. He looked ordinary, unexceptional. What nobody realized back then was that this quiet man was about to declare war. Now, 50 years after that fateful morning, something horrifying has taken place in America. We are talking about a middle class that has effectively ceased to exist. We are talking about $50 trillion in wealth transferred from the pockets of workers into the bank accounts of the top 1%. But Lewis Powell's fate, however, was different. You see, when others saw a changing society, Powell saw a battlefield, and the 34-page document he slid into an envelope that day was the weapon that would kill the American dream. The year was 1971, and corporate America was trembling. The country was still recovering from the social upheaval of the 1960s. Most CEOs were terrified. They saw protesters in the streets, and they saw regulators in Washington coming for their profits. But Lewis Powell wanted something different for his corporate clients. He wanted them to stop apologizing and start fighting. You see, the mood in the U.S. had begun to shift a bit. Ralph Nader was suing car companies and winning. The Environmental Protection Agency had just launched with a $14 billion budget to police pollution. To the average American, this looked like progress. But to Powell, this looked like the end of capitalism. He didn't want to watch from the sidelines. He was an average-looking lawyer, but soon his friends discovered he had a ruthless strategic mind, a mind that allowed him to see political patterns where nobody else could. His friend at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Eugene Sidner, noticed this too. He told Powell that American business was losing the war for public opinion. So Powell decided to listen to his friend. On that summer weekend, while his neighbors were likely barbecuing, Powell went to work. He drafted a confidential memorandum titled Attack on American Free Enterprise System. He warned that the American economic system was under broad attack, but Powell had no idea that he was unleashing one of the most brilliant and honestly destructive political strategies Washington would ever see. So Powell sent his memo to the Chamber of Commerce hopeful and optimistic. And around this time, the numbers in America sort of reflected why he was so worried. Taxes on the highest earners sat at 70%. Unions represented nearly 30% of the workforce. The American worker was getting rich, while the corporate owner was feeling squeezed. Powell's memo was a blueprint to reverse that. It was a lucrative time for social reformers, but a scary time for investors. But you see, you had to be organized to win this game, and business was not organized. Powell wrote, "Business must learn the lesson that political power is necessary, that such power must be assiduously cultivated, and that when necessary, it must be used aggressively." He didn't just want a seat at the table. He wanted to own the table. He identified 4 specific targets: the campus, the media, the courts, and the politics. He told corporations to stop funding universities that taught liberal economics. He told them to buy television stations to control the narrative. The memo wasn't meant for the average American. It was an exclusive playbook for the ultra-wealthy. But Lewis Powell was about to prove that a pen is mightier than a sword. Just 2 months later, President Nixon nominated him to the Supreme Court. Now you have to realize something. Most people thought his political work would stop there. But actually, it was just the beginning. Jesse Livermore had his board boys, but Lewis Powell had lobbyists. And just within a few months, the business community discovered something remarkable. They realized they could literally buy the legislative process if they just spent enough money. It was a pretty unique concept at the time, to be honest. By the mice way, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out to keep uncovering these historical figures who shaped your wallet. Now, as I was saying, the response to Powell's memo wasn't just dumb luck. It was a coordinated mobilization. In 1971, only 175 American firms had registered lobbyists in Washington. They were amateurs, but after the Powell memo circulated, the checkbooks opened. By 1982, That number jumped to 2,445 firms. That is a 1,300% increase in just over a decade. The National Association of Manufacturers moved their offices to D.C. They built a machine. Conservative think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute launched shortly after. These weren't just research centers. They were ammunition factories for Powell's war, generating the arguments that would justify deregulation. By the time the 1980s arrived, the conversation had shifted. The mood in the U.S. began to change from protecting the consumer to liberating the corporation. Now, around this time, the American economy was transforming in ways that would reshape your life today. Up until 1973, productivity and wages rose together. If you worked harder and produced more, you got paid more. It was 11 ratio. But then the Powell Doctrine took hold. Between 1973 and 2013, productivity rose 74%. But hourly compensation? It rose only 9%. The United States was getting rich, but the workers were getting left behind. This massive transfer of wealth would ultimately create the foundation for the inequality we see today. Now Powell had been working as a Supreme Court justice for a few years. And as he honed his legal arguments, his impact followed a pretty interesting pattern. He systematically dismantled the rights of labor and elevated the rights of capital. He believed that corporations were people. Actually, he believed they were better than people. In 1978, he wrote the majority opinion in a case called First National Bank of Boston v. Bellotti. He ruled that corporations had a First Amendment right to spend money on politics. He argued that money was speech. This opened the floodgates. It legalized the purchase of influence. Before this, there were limits. After this, the ceiling was removed. Powell had transformed the Supreme Court from a neutral arbiter into a weapon for the Chamber of Commerce. By the mid-1980s, the plan was working perfectly. But for most Americans, the economy still remained a mysterious world. They didn't see the laws changing in the background. They just saw that their paychecks weren't going as far as they used to. So what happened was the system introduced a substitute for wages. Debt. In 1970, total household debt was manageable. But as wages flatlined, Americans began borrowing to maintain their lifestyle. They replaced their salary with credit cards. This wasn't an accident. It was a structural necessity to keep the economy moving. While the CEOs were celebrating, the average family was drowning. But here is where it gets interesting. Just like Jesse Livermore's research network, the corporate lobby had better data than the public. They knew that if they broke the unions, nobody could stop them. In 1970, 27% of the private sector was unionized. They attacked that relentlessly. Companies began hiring union avoidance consultants, a billion-dollar industry born from Powell's ideology. Today, union membership is around 6%. Without collective bargaining, the leverage evaporated. The CEO-to worker pay ratio exploded. In 1965, it was 20-1. By 2021, it hit 399-1. A CEO now makes more in one morning than their typical employee makes in a year. This victory was massive for the shareholders, but devastating for the country. Now you have to realize something. The government still needs money to run. If corporations pay less, you pay more. That is exactly what happened. In the 1950s, corporate income tax accounted for roughly 30% of federal revenue. Today, it accounts for roughly 6%. The burden shifted from the profit makers to the wage earners. Powell's memo argued that business was being victimized by taxes. They successfully lobbied to change that. In 2020, 55 of America's largest corporations paid $0 in federal corporate income taxes. Nike paid $0, FedEx paid $0. They actually received rebates. Meanwhile, you paid your full share. It was a pretty neat trick, to be honest. The average American was funding the infrastructure that these companies used to make billions. It was the greatest return on investment in history. A few million dollars in lobbying fees saved them trillions in taxes. As the 1990s and 2000s rolled in, the Powell memo generation was in full control. They didn't just lobby the government, they became the government. It's called regulatory capture. The people meant to police the banks were former bankers. The Glass-Steagall Act was repealed in 1999. This removed the wall between gambling and banking. And we all know what happened next, the 2008 financial crisis. Millions of people lost their homes and their life savings. But the bank's fate, however, was different. You see, when others saw crisis, the banks saw a bailout. They crashed the economy, and the taxpayer paid the bill. This is the system Powell designed, privatized gains and socialized losses. The risk is yours, the profit is. There's Jesse Livermore eventually lost his fortune because the market changed. But these corporations rigged the market so they could never lose. Remember the target Powell put on the media? He said the media was too critical of business. Well, in 1983, 50 corporations controlled 90% of American media. That seemed like a lot of diversity. Today, that number is 6. 6 corporations control 90% of what you read, watch, and hear. Comcast, Disney, Warner Brothers, and a few others. Powell's vision of a media that respects corporate interests has been achieved. Investigative journalism budgets have been slashed. Local news has been decimated. Without watchdogs, corruption flourishes. The corporate narrative remains unchallenged. They tell you that stock market highs mean the economy is doing well. But the stock market is not the economy. The top 10% of Americans own 89% of all stocks. So when the line goes up, they get rich. You just get higher prices at the grocery store. Lewis Powell died in 1998. He didn't live to see the 2008 crash. He didn't see the $34 trillion national debt. But he built the machine that created them. He was a polite man who loved his grandchildren. But his legacy is a nation of debtors. The numbers don't lie. The middle class used to hold 61% of the nation's income. Now that number has collapsed. The optimism of the post-war era has come to a screeching halt. Instead of optimism, the atmosphere today is filled with anxiety and polarization. People are looking for someone to blame. They blame the other political party. They blame immigrants. They blame technology. But they are missing the man in the wire-rimmed glasses. The man who turned politics into an auction. The man who turned education into a debt trap. The man who turned the housing market into a casino. We often look for villains with guns. But the man who crippled America wore a suit and spoke in a whisper. So here is the reality we are. Left with the Powell memo wasn't just a letter. It was a prophecy that came true. But recently, we are seeing the first signs of resistance. Unions are winning battles for the first time in decades. Antitrust lawsuits are hitting big tech. So I have a question for you. Do you think the Powell era is finally ending? Or is artificial intelligence about to give corporations even more power? I'm tracking the lobbying numbers on AI right now, and they look terrifyingly similar to 1971. Which scenario do you think plays out? Option A, the people take back the power, or option B, the corporations double down? Drop your prediction in the comments below. And if you want to understand how the banking system is actually rigged against you, you need to watch this documentary I made about the Federal Reserve. I think you'll really enjoy it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.